Next up, we have Aaron Gustafson. He has requested that I introduce him like a Viking. So here it is. Can we play that again? I just started. Right, thank you. In the hollow halls of innovation, Aaron Gustafson stands like a true Viking of the web. He wields his axe, again please, like a mighty axe, cleaving through barriers to form inclusive and accessible digital realm. In the moment, Ortheo Saga, Tim Berners-Lee, the inventor of World Wide Web, bowed in reverence to Aaron, expressing gratitude for making the web better. True story. Aaron, the Viking of the web.
Thank you, Stephanie. Awesome. It's great to be back at Cascadia. Last time I spoke was 2018, before all the craziness happened. So normally, when I start off talking, get my slides up here, maybe, perhaps, possibly. Normally, I don't like to spend too much time talking about my credentials and kind of where I come from and such in my talks, but I want to share a few of these items because I think they help to frame up for you the perspective that I have and how I've come to appreciate accessibility and how I've come to see not only why it's needed, but how we can go about achieving it. So I've been working on the web for a long time. I have earned every bit of gray in my beard. I've been through several of the browser wars that Brian just talked about. And I started out my journey on the web in 1995. I was in college at the time, and we didn't have Ethernet connections in our room or anything like that. We basically had to dial into a central server and then use a tool like Gopher to access the internet. And so when I finally got the opportunity to go check out the web for the first time, it looked something roughly equivalent to this when I waved my magic wand and went to Sony.com. Now, for those who can't see it, this is an approximation of what I saw because I didn't have the ability to do screenshots and stuff back in the day. But this is an example of Sony.com from that time period rendered in Lynx. Lynx is a text-based browser. And in very small text, what you could see here, if you could actually read it, is that there is an image that is named text.gif. Okay? And then there is something that looks like an underline. I think it's an input. And then there is enter.gif, which I'm assuming is a button. But there was no content. There was no context for any of this. I was just basically staring at a blank screen, and I said, you know, this web shit this is bullshit. And I shut it down. I thought it was absolutely just like the worst thing. And then a few months later, my school offered a PPP connection, point-to-point protocol, and I was finally able to use a graphical browser for the first time, and I saw that there was so much that was transformative about the web, so much potential in it. But this initial experience of the web stuck with me and has really framed a lot of how I think about the web over the years. So kind of moving on as I moved into a career working on the web, I took a couple of different jobs in the late 90s, and in 2000, I stumbled on a list apart. And if you're not familiar, a list apart's tagline is, for people who make websites. Just whatever role you play, there's something for you to learn there. But I found a list apart, and I discovered the very early web standards movement and the start of using CSS and semantic HTML. 3 years later, I had my first article published in a list apart. A couple years after that, I actually joined the staff of a list apart, and I took a break and then came back, and I've been its editor-in-chief for the last 7 years. And kind of over the course of that journey, starting in 2003, when I gave my first talk, I've been thinking about accessibility. I've been thinking about web standards, and it's been central to all of the work that I've done and really core to my mission as a web developer, evangelist, teacher, all the different hats that I wear. It's always been about making the web a little bit more egalitarian every day to remove more barriers for people. And so where I want to start today is actually at the intersection of two of my interests, and that is accessibility and then D&I, DEI, however it is that you want to frame it, however you want to refer to it. Because I firmly believe that embedding accessibility into our processes and our organizations really begins with fostering a diverse and inclusive culture. And I'm not talking about hiring token representation of people from different communities, because a lot of that happens out there, token nods to different groups. But really what we should be looking to do is to create an environment that is safe for people from different backgrounds, that is respectful of their differences, that actually values what they bring to the table, no matter what their background is, no matter what their lived experiences are, no matter what their disabilities are. This is another thing that kind of gets forced upon me by just kind of how my life has worked out. So I grew up pretty poor. When I was, after my parents divorced when I was like 6, it was just my mom and I. And anyone who's ever sat down to a meal with me has probably noticed that I eat very quickly. I think I picked that up because we couldn't really afford to heat the house all that much, so stuff got cold fast, so you learn to eat quickly. And like my mom and I used to sleep in the same bed because we could only afford to heat one room, right? So like I grew up pretty poor. Now I've been working for Microsoft for a number of years. I'm pretty well off, right? I have a much different experience. And you know, I have a lot of privilege that comes with that. And then at the same time, my son is black, and I see the experience that he's going to have growing up wealthier, but with the stigma of growing up black in the US and all of the baggage that comes with that. And it really throws into sharp contrast all of the difference of experiences that we can have in different aspects of society, technology access, the types of financials that we have available to us, opportunities, connections, those sorts of things. And I think we need to be aware of that, not to feel bad about it, but to recognize it and recognize the influence that that can have on the sorts of experiences that we create when we're building for the web or software in general. I think too often D&I gets framed as being wholly focused on optics, and indeed, sometimes it is. But there is real value in having a diverse team. And it starts by recognizing that teams that are effectively a monoculture have a very narrow view of what lived experience, what human experience is, right? It makes it very hard for them to imagine what the experiences of people in different scenarios with different lived experiences, different capabilities, different devices have. You know, a lot of us who live in a wealthy Western nation and live in tech bubbles like Seattle, San Francisco, New York, et cetera, a lot of us have access to high-speed internet. A lot of us have access to very modern devices, always connected, et cetera, but that is not how everyone lives. That's not even how everyone lives in America. Right? If you go into the middle of America, if you go to rural Alabama or something like that, you may be dealing with people who are only on mobile networks, that is their primary access to the web. They might be on older phones, they may be on a pay-as-you-go phone. I don't know if any of you have used pay-as-you-go smartphones. They are vastly different than what you have in your pocket. And so by creating and really nurturing diverse teams with people who come from different backgrounds, we can fill the gaps in knowledge that monocultural teams have. We, of course, need to be ready to accept their lived experiences and embrace that and show them that we value that. But it can really help us to fill those knowledge gaps in order to build better products that are capable of reaching more people. Exclusion happens when we solve problems using our own biases. Or to put it another way, when we build for people who are like us, we often exclude the people who are not like us. Let that sit for a minute. Where do you fall in sort of this graphic of people, right? Are you only designing for people who are also on the latest and greatest smartphones and fully always connected and always accessing with, let's say, touch, or always accessing with a stylus or something like that? For a long time, disability was framed in the context of an individual's inability to do something relative to what a quote-unquote normal person could do. Let's just leave out the fact that normal doesn't exist. Normal is not a word that we should use. But regardless of that, it's still the wrong way to look at things. Disability is a direct result of the design choices that we make when we don't take into account the diversity of humanity. Okay? Disabilities are created when there is a mismatch between a person's abilities and the environment or the system within which they are trying to operate. Okay? Disabilities also exist on a spectrum. It's not just in terms of severity either. You can have somebody who maybe has lost the use of an upper extremity, it may be their dominant arm, maybe not, all the way through to somebody who has a situational disability, maybe they broke that arm as opposed to lost it, or somebody who's a new parent holding their child. They have it's permanent, temporary, and then situational disability. So the person carrying the child has a situational disability. So all of these disabilities exist on a spectrum, and they vary based on the circumstances that we find ourselves in, the activities that we're trying to do, and so on. It's an age-old example, but the reason that we constantly bring it up is that it's just so applicable, and that is the curb cut, right? For those of you who don't know the history, the curb cut was actually an act of vandalism and defiance against the status quo in an effort to make it easier for people with mobility disabilities to make it from the sidewalk to the street and vice versa. It began in Berkeley, if I'm remembering correctly, and people were literally taking sledgehammers to the curbs. Okay, that's how they came about. And we look around, and they're pretty much universal now in most modern cities. And the reason is that it's not only just the right thing to do to be beneficial for people who need that from a mobility disability standpoint, but it's also useful to kids on bikes, parents pushing strollers, the UPS delivery person who's carrying far too many Amazon packages to an apartment building in downtown Seattle. Captions are another great example of this, right? These were originally created for people who were deaf or hard of hearing, as an accommodation for them, and first originated, I think, in the 1970s, if I'm remembering correctly, on TV. But now they've become very much ingrained in our experiences of the world. In fact, I believe the last stat that I saw was somewhere around half of millennials and Gen Z use subtitles all the time. I know for me, it kicked into high gear when my son was born. And I wanted to be able to watch a show while holding him and not wake him up from his nap, right? But it's part of how we do things. It's basically the main thing on TikTok. You've got people doing various other things, but subtitles are the thing that are on so many of those TikTok videos. And in some ways, you can even think about it in the animated GIF context as well, right? Like those are basically subtitles in a lot of cases for what somebody was saying. Now, depending on how expansive your definition of disability is, you could even consider the technologies that people are using as being part of that picture. So, for example, network access, whether people have it or not, and the speed with which they can access the internet. Their battery life, that has a tremendous impact. How much power is your client-side JavaScript framework consuming? How much is it making that chipset work, and how quickly are you drawing down the battery? And thinking about, what does it take for somebody to replenish that power? Yes, we may have ubiquitous power for the most part in places like the United States, but what about for somebody who relies on solar or a hand crank or a bicycle tethered to a generator, right? How long does it take them to get enough power to access your website? I remember a little bit of a tangent, but I remember I contributed a recipe to an article for my local paper a number of years ago. And I went to the website when they posted it, and it took a while to load, and I was like, gosh, this is not only is it loading the article, it's loading a ton of ads and some auto-playing video and stuff like that. I'm really curious to run this through what does my site cost. I don't know if any of you have used that tool before, created by Tim Kadlec, whatdoesmysitecost.com. And what I found out running that one page through what does my site cost is that it was more expensive than buying that day's paper that article showed in. That's mind-blowing to me, right? These are things that we need to be thinking about. Device speed and capabilities, another one. We need to be thinking about what the CPU is capable of doing, not assuming that there's an NPU on there now that people are starting to move in that direction as well. Of course, screen resolution, the quality of the screen, the color depth, all of these things affect the user experiences, and all of them can impact and create disability among your users. And then finally, interaction methods as well. People need to interact with machines in the ways that they need to interact with them. That could be through a sip, puff, straw, that could be through a trackpad, could be through a pencil, could be through any of a number of things. Could be touch, or it might not be. And there are changes that we need to do to address the needs of these people. And changes that we make to address the needs of one population will impact other folks. So for example, if we're making changes to address the needs of somebody who is low vision, right? We can make changes to improve the contrast so people can see what's going on the website, can tell that something is a button, tell that something is an input field, tell that something is navigation. And the same changes that we would make for that context end up being beneficial for somebody who is, let's say, on a mobile device, who has turned their brightness down because they're at that last 5% on their phone, right? And they're outside, right? Like that's a very specific intersection of sections of experiences, but that you are at a disability at that point when you are trying to access websites, and we need to be cognizant of that. Getting your teams to shift the way that they think about these things won't happen overnight, but providing opportunities for employees to learn from each other's lived experiences can go a long way towards helping to build that understanding. And it can go a long way towards creating a culture that not only accepts differences, but values them. And I keep saying values because it is so important. We need to recognize that those differences have value. We don't just say we're all the human race and we paper over all of our differences, because our differences have value, right? Now, of course, there are some people who struggle to recognize that there is value in diverse teams. And so for those hard-to-reach folks, I turn to the one thing that tends to motivate most of them, which is money. So for particularly resistant individuals and teams, especially those fixated on the costs inherent in making products more accessible, I often like to shift them from focusing about accessibility as being the quote-unquote right thing to do, instead to talk about it as a market opportunity. Because when we build inaccessible products, we're actually artificially suppressing the number of potential customers that we have. One thing we found, this is ages ago, when Alistapart decided to no longer ship CSS to Netscape Navigator 4, so that tells you how long ago this is. We decided to no longer ship CSS to Netscape Navigator 4. All of a sudden, our metrics for Netscape Navigator 4 went up because the experience was shitty. And now, even though the experience was now just text, right, like lightly styled up text, it was a better experience than it had been when we were trying to get it to do absolute positioning and things like that. So we often design things and we just assume that the experience is bad in a particular browser or a particular device. And if we at least gave like a little bit of thought to what that experience could be like, even if it's not, we don't have to give people the same experience, but at least if we're giving them some experience, allowing them to do something in there, we're going to create more opportunities for people to use our technologies. And when we build more accessible products, we create more opportunity to generate revenue. So Facebook bought WhatsApp for $19 billion in 2014. And while many people would see that and say, that's not an accessibility story, I'm going to tell you that it is. By the way, that's $25 billion in today's dollars. At the time, WhatsApp was one of like 1,200 different chat apps in the App Store. They had launched in the App Store in 2009. What really set it apart was WhatsApp's user base. Now, how did they acquire such a large user base? I think it was like 400 million people at the time they were acquired by Facebook. It didn't only distribute in the App Store. They weren't only focused on the latest and greatest Apple devices, right? They supported Android. They supported BlackBerry. They supported Symbian. They supported Windows Phone, and more. They recognized and embraced the diversity of the market out there, and they reaped the benefits globally, while others missed out. And in much the same way, by embracing accessibility and embedding it into the way that we work, we can reach the 1.3 billion people with disabilities around the globe. So while there's certainly an adjustment period and an added cost for shifting to accessible product development, once product teams have integrated accessibility into the whole product lifecycle, the added cost is negligible. Now, anecdotally, I heard from a team that was actually mentioned earlier in one of the talks. They built a wildly successful product in the early Ajax days without considering accessibility from the jump. And when they realized that they needed to make that experience accessible, it took them twice as much time to do so as it would have had they included accessibility from the beginning. As a counterexample to that, I'm going to share something that I experienced when, in my prior to Microsoft days, when I was running my own consultancy. We had undertaken a project that was looking at the login experience for people specifically on iPhone, iPad, Android, and Windows Phone. And we were reimagining that as a web flow within the context of native apps for those platforms. And we followed the development philosophy of progressive enhancement. That's what I'm probably most known for. And so we had built that, and progressive enhancement naturally produces more accessible experiences for people. And so in the process of doing that, we were only targeting those browsers, but they came back to us about 9 months later, and they were like, hey, we want to roll this out to our MDOT site. Here's a list of 1,300 different user agents that access our login page in 2 days. 1,300 different user agents. That's crazy. We're talking like OpenWave, BlackBerry 4, BlackBerry 5, like some really, really challenging browsers, shall we say. And so we gave them a budget for it that was about a third of the original project budget to add these 1,300 new devices. The biggest lump of that we were expecting to be purchasing devices in order to do the testing. And what we found out was that actually our process worked so well that we came in at half time and half budget on that project. And the client had no way to take money back from us. They had never had a project come in under budget. That was just something that did not happen. Like, that's how transformative what this was. So what I'm saying is that by building accessibly, by thinking about this stuff from the get-go, by thinking about sort of the most baseline experience and building up the experience from there with accessibility at the heart of it, we can reap huge dividends by enabling ourselves to more quickly reach more devices and more people on a global basis. So this is a typical development lifecycle. I'm not going to get into all the various loops that often happen throughout. I'm just going to concentrate on the major milestones here. But in organizations where accessibility is not a thought or an afterthought, accessibility issues mainly remain unaddressed until something bad happens. So it could be a complaint coming through customer service, that's best case scenario, or it's a lawsuit, right? Or it's bad PR or something like that. Right? And in order to address that accessibility issue, we have to validate and document the issue. We have to build a remediation plan. We have to rework the software. We have to test the fix and any knock-on effects that fix may have on all the other code in the app, and then we have to deploy that change. That's a very expensive process, right? It's very disruptive to the forward momentum of the product team. It can create a culture that's actually antagonistic to accessibility. And it's a very reactive approach, which could mean that you have to actually hire more people in order to deal with the volume of accessibility bugs that you're getting, as well as continue forward momentum on your product. And if your org engages in accessibility in this way, it's probably time to start tracking the financial burden that each accessibility bug places on your organization. Not as a way to undermine spending time on it, but to establish a baseline against which you can measure the relative cost of other approaches to addressing accessibility within your org. In organizations that recognize the importance of accessibility, but who maybe see it as a checklist, accessibility compliance is largely happening in the testing phase, or the quality assurance part of the lifecycle. Here, the PR risks aren't as great, and lawsuit risk is pretty minimal as well, but it's not a very efficient place to be doing accessibility testing from a product standpoint. Teams are still having to rewrite code, sometimes even whole product features, to bring a product into compliance, and they will view it as a chore or a headache. Right? Instead, if we want to really embed accessibility into our process, we need to move it earlier and earlier in the process, which allows us to avoid the risks inherent in other approaches, and we can catch our potential accessibility issues early. Ideally, we can catch those things in the planning phase, whether that's overall product planning, whether that is our engineering plan, but we can do that before any design has been done, any code has been written, and it's very cheap to change our mind at this point, right, and to bring new information on board. Accessibility should also be practiced throughout the design experience. Right? There are a lot of tools that are out there for designers nowadays that operate in a lot of the stuff that folks are used to working in. So Figma, could be Canva, could be tools by Adobe. They have a lot of accessibility tools as well to help designers to do a better job of incorporating accessibility in those early visual designs and early prototypes as well. There's even some stuff, Microsoft just released a plugin for Figma that helps out with making adjustments for inclusion of people with cognitive differences. So like there are lots of tools that are starting to come out there. It's very, 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 very cool space. Developers also should be obviously considering accessibility from the beginning, and they can do that through the use of real-time feedback and remediation tools, often in their IDEs or in the browser itself. Accessibility Insights is one of those that's also from Microsoft. I know the folks who work on it, they do a great job. They have several ways of sort of managing accessibility testing and compliance testing. They have something called FastPass, which can find a good chunk of the low-hanging fruit bugs that you will encounter, things like contrast, font sizes, that sort of stuff, very easily, and can help you nip that stuff in the bud very early on. They also have a quick assessment tool that in about 30 minutes will take you through some of the more advanced accessibility testing. Or if you want to go full bore into it, they have a full assessment tool that will actually walk you through how to test each piece of the WCAG spec in order to determine whether you have any accessibility issues in the various parts of that document. Accessibility Insights also does bug exporting. So you can export out to your bug service. It can generate PDF reports for your management team and stuff like that too, if you need to do compliance check-ins. So that's kind of cool. Accessibility Insights is built on top of Axe. Axe is a product from DeQ, which is another fantastic tool that's available in your browser. It becomes part of your dev tools within the browser. And then, of course, there are a ton of IDE extensions as well, depending on what IDE you're working in. I'm currently showing ones from VS Code, but there are a ton of great tools out there. Now, AI is starting to create some really interesting opportunities for us in terms of being able to analyze code, be able to suggest remediations. I would not say that GitHub Copilot is great at doing this yet because it was trained on a lot of crappy code when it comes to accessibility. But some of the things that I have found interesting is highlighting a particular section of code and then asking questions, like, hey, could you explain this to me? Or, hey, what could I do to make this more accessible? And sometimes stuff like that, you get better suggestions. And one thing that I have found as well is that if I'm working in a code base, like a library, pattern library, that is more accessible, it will actually start making suggestions to me based on the code that I'm working in that are more accessible as well. So it's kind of a nice virtuous cycle there. And then there are a bunch of other like kind of smaller players like Test Party that are working on using AI to do static and dynamic analysis of your applications. They're also working on debugging for iOS apps as well, which is pretty cool, to find not only find accessibility issues, but suggest remediations. So it's another cool tool, and there are quite a few of them out there that are working in this space now. Definitely recommend looking into that. And of course, we should still be doing testing in kind of that quality assurance stage to make sure that we're not having anything slip through the cracks in terms of our overall processes. So hopefully that's part of either a build step or CI/CD or something like that. Some part of your product lifecycle. Pally is probably the most popular CI/CD tool for running, I think it's Axe under the hood, but running Axe against your code base, which is pretty helpful. To reinforce all of this and build a culture of accessibility, organizations also need to invest in upskilling their teams. So internal design and coding workshops can be really helpful. If you're interested, Microsoft did just release through Microsoft Learn, I think, our entire suite of accessibility training, what we do for our internal engineers. So that's all available for free. But there are lots of other resources out there. There are a ton of people doing great content. Sarah Swaydon is another person who's done some fantastic accessibility training. Highly recommend her stuff. But doing this can help not only familiarize the team with accessibility, but it can really build a sense of purpose around accessibility for the team, and to have them working together collaboratively to identify and address accessibility bugs early, right? Hopefully even before they become bugs, identifying potential issues. And taken all together, this is what we mean when we talk about shifting left, or I guess for you guys, left, in terms of how we develop, right? Trying to shift accessibility earlier in the process so that we have fewer poor outcomes in the end. It's worth noting that we will never produce products that are 100% accessible for every person on the planet. We're always going to grow our awareness of the barriers that we create for people when we're designing. And so we're going to be constantly learning about new issues that we've created, and we have to figure out solutions for them, especially at the intersections of different disabilities. So, you might have some solutions for somebody who is deaf, and you might have some for somebody who's blind, but what about somebody who's deafblind, right? It becomes interesting to try to figure out those challenges. It's also important to recognize that accessibility is not a checklist, right? It's a journey, and it's a journey that we're all on. So instead of focusing on some mythical destination or an end state where we can say something is final, it's accessible, it's all good, we should instead commit to removing barriers when we find them, right? Identifying and removing them as early as possible. And hiring, cultivating diverse teams will help us to grow that awareness. And it'll help us find those potential barriers before they fester into problems for our applications. And that's why I hold that embedding accessibility starts with fostering a diverse and inclusive culture. And that's it for me. Thank you all so much for listening. Happy to answer questions. You can feel free to reach out to me on any of the socials or via my website, and happy to catch with you in the snack hall as well. Thank you all very much.
Thank you, Aaron.